Hi all, in this lecture we're going to look at some material in chapter 14 of our text. This chapter focuses on human communication. In this particular lecture we're going to look at disorders of human communication. First we'll take a look at two different disorders of communication that you might be familiar with, in particular if you've had cognitive psychology before in the past. The first one we'll look at is Broca's aphasia. So this is a disorder of language. In particular, language production. So this is characterized by speech that sounds quite slow, laborious, or even might sound as though it's non-fluent. We have much better language comprehension in these individuals that have Broca's aphasia than we do production. So this isn't an inability to demonstrate good receptive language, meaning they can receive speech, they can interpret speech, and understand and comprehend speech. They can understand what they hear, but they have very strong difficulties producing responses back. So it's an issue of production more so than comprehension of speech. In particular, individuals that have Broca's aphasia also demonstrate difficulty with function of words. In particular, grammar seems to be a very big challenge. For example, people with Broca's aphasia a lot of times seem to struggle with using words that end in ed, but interestingly, they more readily use words that end in ing. So I don't know, we can kind of ponder why that might be, and there could be some rules of speech that might help explain that particular phenomenon. But in general, people that have Broca's tend to struggle with grammatical rules in speech. They seem to be much better with using content words. So rather than focusing on the grammatics of speech, they do better with being able to use content words like just basic nouns and verbs. And lastly, somebody with Broca's may also struggle with what we call anomia. So this, you can kind of think about this as kind of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. What it is it's just difficulty word finding, or finding the correct word to use. So if you've ever had that where you've been speaking to someone and for the life of you, you just cannot find the correct word. People with Broca's aphasia struggle with that a lot. And here in this figure from our text, we can see the area in the brain. This is called Broca's area. This would be the area that would have damage or lesions in somebody who has been diagnosed with Broca's aphasia. The other disorder of language that you might be familiar with is Wernicke's aphasia. This happens when there's damage or lesioning to Wernicke's area in the brain. With this particular type of aphasia, folks struggle with language comprehension rather than language production, like Broca's aphasia. Something that can happen with Wernicke's is what's called pure word deafness. Now, these folks that struggle with this, they're not deaf. They have issues specifically with being able to interpret individual words that are spoken to them. So they can interpret sounds. So if they hear like a dog barking or a doorbell ringing, they recognize those sounds. They also recognize a human voice. So when they're being spoken to, they recognize that. They can also recognize emotional tone or inflection. So if somebody is speaking to them in a very excited way or a very stern way, they can gather the tone of the conversation. But some folks that have this will report, I hear you talking to me and I know you're saying things, but I don't understand the words you're saying. So it is definitely something unique to word recognition for these folks. There are some people who have something a little bit more specific, and this is more of a deficit in converting thoughts to words in a kind of what we would call a more typical way. This is called anomic aphasia. And this by itself is different than Wernicke's aphasia in that people who struggle with this, they can understand what other people say. And what they say back makes sense, but they often choose kind of a different way of saying it. So they may structure their speech differently than how most of us might. Here we're looking at an MRI scan of somebody who struggles with pure word deafness. So again, that's that struggle with being able to recognize words in spoken speech. And we can see here, this is the superior temporal lobe of this patient, and the arrow is pointing to an area that has some damage here. So this kind of lines up with this particular area maybe playing a role in the issue with pure word deafness that this patient was struggling with. Here's just a table from your book kind of listing out a bunch of different aphasias, some of the ones that I've talked about already, and a couple of additional ones. So conduction aphasia and transcortical sensory aphasia as well are listed here, and you can kind of compare and contrast. So areas of lesioning or damage, so which disorders are correlated with which areas of damage, and then also the types of speech and production that are affected depending upon the type of aphasia that we're looking at. Next, we'll kind of move on to disorders more related to reading and writing. There is some relation between reading and writing to those of aphasia. So both speech comprehension and speech production, it makes sense that those would be related to issues with reading and writing. So the relationship, a lot of times is pretty strong, so that reading and writing skills of people with aphasia, they typically mirror their issues that they have when speaking and comprehending. So a lot of times, if you have an issue with speech comprehension, that's going to be reflected in your reading and your writing. Same thing with production. There is also something called pure alexia. This is a loss of ability to read, but what's interesting is that these folks, they struggle with reading, but they can write. This is produced by brain damage, but these folks can write. They can write, word stories that make perfect sense, but they can't read it. They can't read the written word. And I wanted to mention that here before we talk about more specific disorders of reading and writing that are going to be more in relation to the article reading of the week. But I thought this one was quite interesting, the ability to write but not read. First, we need to look quickly at different ways of reading, because depending upon the type of disorder that you might have, you may struggle with one way of reading versus another, or you may be able to read in a certain way, but not in another way. So firstly, we'll talk about whole word reading. So that's where we basically read by word recognition. I think that that's how most of us read, basically by sight words or sight reading. If you remember being a very small kid, or if you have a small kid, they have sight words and they have sight word cards, and it's basically like flashcards. They have to recognize a word on sight. And if you think about how you read, you just see words, and most of them you just know, right? So it's kind of a sight word type of phenomenon. You see it, you know it, you can immediately say it. Whole word reading or whole word recognition. Now, what happens when you see a word that you don't know? Then you do something called phonetic reading. This is where you're reading by decoding the different parts of the word or different sounds of significance in the words. So you're basically reading kind of by sound. And if you notice, kiddos that are learning to read do this with almost every single word. They'll make the complete phonetic sound of every part of every word because they don't have whole word recognition yet. Now here we can take a look at where these different types of reading seem to kind of be more represented in the brain in terms of brain activity. So we have the visual word form area, or the VWF for short, and that's more tied into whole word reading. So when you're just recognizing words on sight, this particular area seems to have a fair bit of activity. If we look at the top part of the schematic here, we can see these areas here highlighted, in particular the connection between the inferior frontal cortex and the temporoparietal cortex, especially the directional activity from the temporal-parietal cortex to the inferior frontal cortex. This seems to be, this particular firing pathway seems to be more activated when we have somebody doing more phonological reading rather than sight word reading. Now that we've taken a quick look at two different types of reading, whole word and phonetic reading, we'll take a look at our first reading disorder, and that is surface dyslexia. Folks that struggle with this read words phonetically. So they really have a very hard time being able to recognize words on sight or use the whole word method. So that is the method in which the VWFA, or the visual word form area of the brain, is more active. So it could be that that particular area of the brain is damaged or has some lesioning with patients that struggle with service dyslexia. But again, these are going to be folks that when they read, they're going to be reading every word phonetically. So they're going to be breaking down every individual word into its individual components, rather than being able to just recognize words almost instantly on sight and reading fluently. Here's just kind of a time progression of what this looks like for folks. So again, if they see a word, they're not going to have that whole word recognition phenomenon. They're going to see it more as an unfamiliar word, and they're going to look at letter recognition first. So what letters do I recognize? They're going to treat it as an unfamiliar word that they've never seen before. So they're going to look at the individual letters, then think about the phonetic coding or the sound of those letters, and start pronouncing each individual sound of all of the letters to eventually say some form of the word aloud. And again, this is going to be tied in with surface dyslexia. Another form of dyslexia is called direct dyslexia. These folks are going to be able to read aloud pretty well. In particular, familiar words. They're going to do pretty well with the whole word reading method. So sight word recognition for these folks is pretty good, but they're not able to really understand what they read. So by the end of the reading period, they're not going to be able to really tell you much about what they read. They're going to struggle with reading comprehension. In addition, there seems to be kind of a deficit in the ability to read phonetically. So if they see an unfamiliar word that they need to work out phonetically, they really struggle there with that. And the last form of dyslexia that we'll talk about here is phonological dyslexia. This is similar to direct dyslexia in that they can also read using the whole word method. So if it's familiar words, they're going to do just fine, but they struggle with being able to pronounce words they don't recognize or sound words out. So if they see unfamiliar words, they're basically unable to read those words. So for direct dyslexia and phonological dyslexia, it's going to look something more like this. In particular, phonological dyslexia, whole word recognition is going to be just fine. And in phonological dyslexia, letter recognition is also going to be fine. But being able to produce the sounds of those particular letters in the word is not really going to be able to happen with these folks. So only whole word reading remains for people with this particular diagnosis. It does seem as though the visual word form area that I've mentioned earlier in the brain is tied into the ability to not only learn new languages, but to be able to be quite flexible between languages. So being able to be what we call plastic in this particular area of the brain. If there's plasticity, then your ability to use language and learn new language seems to be enhanced. So the ability to learn new languages could be correlated to more plasticity in the VWFA area within the brain. The last bit we'll talk about here are what we call developmental types of dyslexias. These are dyslexias that seem to have a genetic component to them. Also, these particular type of dyslexias are not tied into IQ. So this isn't a reflection upon somebody's intelligence. This is a specific disorder. So this is going to be tied into deficiencies with phonological awareness, so being able to interpret parts of speech. Also difficulty in just writing. And we also find decreased activity in that VWFA area of the brain in folks that have developmental dyslexias. So again, that lends further support that that particular area of the brain is quite important to language. Here we take a look at the different types of dyslexia as well as pure alexia that we've talked about in the latter portion of this lecture so far, and we're just comparing and contrasting. So we're looking at which particular reading disorder is affecting whole word reading versus phonetic reading, what particular area of the brain might have damage that could be tied in with that particular reading disorder, and just other comments about it, about each speech reading disorder. So we can just kind of take a look here and compare and contrast each one. Here we compare phonological and orthographic dysgraphia. We take a look at more specifics. So, for example, whole word versus phonetic writing. People with phonological dysgraphia makes sense that they're going to struggle a lot with phonetic writing. Orthographic dysgraphia is going to be kind of the flip. They're going to struggle with whole word writing, but do okay with the phonetic pronunciation of words. We can also see here what we think the brain areas or the correlates in the brain could be with these type of issues, but both of these types of dysgraphia, but notice that we don't have any real substantial data for that yet. So more research needs to be done looking into issues of writing.